just want to say at the beginning, I'm kind of pivoting away from Aimee's assignment. I think in the program it's described as a talk about whether this case ended the 60s. And I'm kind of moving more into the drug aspect and asking the question whether or not these government scientists who had the intersections with Manson after he was released from prison in 1967 were influencing his behavior and what became of his kind of trajectory into Los Angeles and murder in 2 years. Also, I don't know, has anybody in here read the book besides Aimee? Okay, so I have to give a little context first so you understand what the case was about. These murders happened in August of 1969, and it took about 3 months for the LAPD to figure out who did it and take this group into custody. And the group was a family of kind of what they called hippies, who were led by Charles Manson, who'd spent half his life in federal institutions, prison and juvenile detention centers and whatnot. And it was a real shock to the culture because at the time the murders happened, people thought it was a drug burn or some kind of rivalry between some of the people in the house. And the main murder victim that people knew the best was Sharon Tate, who was the wife of Roman Polanski, the director. She was an actress. And it's a pretty horrific crime. She was 8.5 months pregnant and was stabbed 17 times. Her house guests, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish friend of Polanski, and Abigail Folger, a coffee heiress, and Jay Sebring, a hairstylist and former boyfriend of Sharon's, were all slaughtered. There was blood writing left on the walls. Sharon and Abigail were hung for a while. So it was something that really kind of rattled the system. And 3 months later, when they apprehended these people and charged them with the crime, all of a sudden there were hippie girls with flowers in their hair and babies photographed at the commune where they lived in Spahn Ranch, basically saying whatever happened had to happen. It was done with love. The murders were called the Helter-Skelter murders because the prosecutor contended that Manson had brainwashed his followers into believing that there was a race war that he called Helter-Skelter, and he wanted to trigger it, make it happen sooner. He sent his followers to this house to kill the inhabitants who were strangers to them, but he was familiar with the house. And he wanted them to leave signs to implicate the Black Panthers and ignite what he called the Helter-Skelter race war. A couple other things you need to know before I actually officially start is at this time there were 2 government programs going on. One was called Chaos, which was a domestic counterintelligence operation run by the CIA, and it had started in 1967. And the aim of this was to stop what the government believed was this left-wing movement that was about to cause a civil war. So they were infiltrating leftist groups, black activist groups, Panthers and whatnot, and with agents posing as members and provoking them to commit crimes and either use that to arrest them or actually get them to kill each other. The FBI had a similar program called COINTELPRO, which had the exact same agenda. And they were both operating at the same time. And both offices for both of these programs opened in 1967 in San Francisco and then spread through the country. And neither of them were disclosed, or nobody knew about them until the mid to late 70s when there were congressional hearings. And the last one was called MK Ultra, which is a brainwashing program that began in about late 1949, 48, 49. And this program was the most expensive operation the CIA had ever done. It was illegal for a number of reasons. The CIA isn't allowed to operate on domestic soil. So they were doing similar things. They were using people and giving them drugs without their knowledge and trying to see if they could control their behavior Their ultimate objective was to create what's popularly known as a Manchurian candidate, somebody who's brainwashed to kill someone and not have any recollection of being brainwashed, and just that was the ultimate goal. That operation lasted from 49 to about 73. It was discontinued, and then it wasn't exposed again until about 75, 76. So all this is kind of a cauldron of stuff that was also going on in 1967 that kind of opens up into the lecture I'm about to give already. So a lot of people might know the famous Joan Didion quote about the morning of these murders, thinking that the 60s were officially over. It was a pretty turbulent time, and again, these were her friends. She was in Hollywood, but nobody had any idea who did it for about 3 months. On August 9th, 1969, when the murders happened, these were the headlines. Rumors spread like wildfire through Los Angeles, through the United States, that there was some kind of ritualistic murder. Because of the blood writing, and there was a noose and rope, and Sharon had the literature marks on her neck. So all these rumors began. People were really, really terrified, but it took them till December to make the arrest. So when the group was arrested, it kind of defied logic at the time, because what the information that started coming out the next week was that this was a peace-loving commune, kind of a group marriage commune, led by this man named Charlie Manson, who killed these people, and nobody knew why these murders had happened. I also should say, after the Tate murders, the next night, a couple named the LaBiancas were killed across town in Los Feliz, also stabbed dozens of times, also blood writing left on the walls. So when the trial happened, that's when the whole narrative kind of unfolded. So from 1970, June of 1970 until the convictions in 71, 4 of the Manson family members were tried for the murders of the Tate victims and the LaBianca victims in the Los Angeles courthouse. The followers of Manson, who weren't charged with crimes, would hold vigils outside the courthouse and do stunts. Manson shaved his head one day, and then the next day, his co-defendants, Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins, the three across there with the shaved heads, they shaved their heads, and then the family shaved their heads. Manson carved an X into his forehead and appeared in the court with the scab of a cross on his forehead. And the women did the same thing, and the followers did the same thing. Anything he did, they would mimic. And it became a real kind of circus atmosphere. So Vince Bugliosi, the prosecutor, said that he explained this helter-skelter race war motive. This is why these murders happened. These people were just zombies who would do whatever Manson said. And they didn't help their case at all, because they were doing whatever he said in the courtroom. When they were finally convicted, Vince Bugliosi, the prosecutor, had a tough thing to do next, which was the death penalty phase of the trial. So to argue death, somebody to get the death penalty, there can't be mitigating circumstances. So he had already convicted them by saying the reason they committed the murders was because Manson told them to do it. He sent them to kill whoever they encountered in these two houses, and they did it. Well, now he had to show that they had some kind of free will or free volition. And so how can they be robots and also kill on their own? He somehow persuaded the jury of that, and they were convicted, and they got death penalties. But their lawyers were trying to show that they couldn't do both. And they were arguing that Manson had programmed them with LSD, and they weren't responsible for what they did. That didn't work. They all got the death sentences, and then the state of California overturned the death penalty about 5 years later, so their terms were changed to life with parole. Nixon got involved in the trial, which you're not supposed to do if you're a sitting president, to declare before the verdicts came in that they were all guilty. That almost caused a mistrial. So now I want to go back to the Summer of Love, 1967, in the Haight Ashbury. Manson was released from prison after 9 years in 1967. He was 32 years old. He was a barely literate con, and he immediately when he was released, he refused to sign his release forms. He didn't want to leave. He said, "The prison is my home. This is the only place I know." But he had to be released. And the day he was released, he violated his parole by going up to the Bay Area without permission. He should have immediately been sent back to prison, but instead he was assigned to Roger Smith, a federal parole officer. And Roger Smith is an interesting history. After the murders, after these guys were arrested for the murders, he did one interview and he said Manson was the most hostile parolee he'd ever encountered. And he knew there was nothing he could do, yet for the next year, every time Manson got in trouble, he would not violate his parole, but kind of reward him for it and kind of enable this, this Manson family commune. Manson started building his commune in the Haight in the spring of 1967. So he was arrested in March for interfering with a police officer and contributing to the delinquencies of a minor, which is a serious offense. But again, this becomes a pattern for the next 2 years. Every time he broke the law, instead of being revoked and sent back to prison, it was dismissed and he was allowed to continue as his family grew and grew. Now, I want to go into a little bit of the background of Roger Smith. He came from Chicago. He studied criminology there, got a graduate or a master's degree, and was a federal parole officer there. Then he went to the Bay Area to University of California, Berkeley, to study criminology, get his PhD. And the first paper he published, what's it called, Status, Politics, and the Image of the Addict, is interesting. It was about a movement in the early 20th century in San Francisco to kind of demonize the Chinese population. So the Chinese had come over to San Francisco, the Bay Area, at the end of the 1800s to help build railroads. And they had kind of taken over the city of San Francisco, and the state and the city wanted to get rid of the Chinese after they'd been useful by building the railroads and they didn't need them anymore. So many of them used opium. So what they did, and this is kind of an early COINTELCHAOS type operation, is they would infiltrate the Chinese communities that were using opium in dens and make them have agents provoke them to commit crimes so they could demonize them and differentiate them. And Roger wrote a paper on this that was published in the School of Criminology's magazine. And this is his conclusion. At the end of this program, they had differentiated them, and they were able to move them out of the neighborhoods that they want to develop. They were able to deport a lot of them. So this all was kind of Roger's field of inquiry at that point in 1966. Then from 1965 to 67, Roger, still a criminology student, still working as a parole officer in the Bay Area, started studying Oakland gangs. And he had a research team, and they would infiltrate the gangs and be participant observers, where they would kind of survey them, and their goal was to find out why some of these teenagers in the teen gangs who used drugs would become violent and some wouldn't become violent. And they were trying to figure out what was the difference, what caused some kids to become violent. Was it drugs? Was it psychology? And he was, by 67, he was prominent enough to testify to Congress about it, and was just starting to become kind of a national figure in criminology. So we jump now to June of 67, the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic opens. So in the Summer of Love, in San Francisco, they anticipated 100,000 kids coming into the city to kind of experiment with drugs, free love. And David Smith opened the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic to serve these kids who he knew weren't going to have medical services. They were going to also have bad drug trips. David Smith, Roger Smith, no relations, but both researchers in the same community in the Haight in 1967. So David Smith was called Dr. Dave. He's kind of iconic in San Francisco, and I'm surprised that he's never spoken here. He's an LSD expert. He's still alive in his 80s. He established this clinic, got worldwide attention, and a lot of funding, and it was a free clinic, so all the people that came there got free services, and most of the staff was volunteers. He was also getting funding from the government and to do research at the same time on the hippie community. Now we'll go back into David's background a little bit. This is him. He had come up from Bakersfield, California in 1962 to study medicine at Berkeley, the same school. And his first paper, which he said was kind of his defining work, or his first study, which was going to be for his PhD, was on mice who were put in aggregate situations. He anticipated communes coming in 1965, so he wanted to see how mice crowding with the introduction of amphetamines could create violence. And his research also wanted to isolate what factors of the mice cause them to behave what ways. And he found that they would be fine living together without drugs, but once he introduced amphetamines, they would get so violent that they would attack and kill each other in frenzied murder. So then he was giving them other drugs to see if he could modify that behavior. So he gave them chloropazine, I think, and ibogaine. And he was also giving them LSD, which he didn't publish in the papers, but he wanted to see if he could control some of the behavior. So he wrote a book in 1971 about the founding of the clinic, where he starts talking about that research and how it kind of was this historical coincidence that what he saw in 67 was this kind of explosion of communal living in the Haight and drugs, LSD and amphetamine, that resembled what he had seen in his laboratory research in 1965. In 67, kind of at the end of that summer, amphetamine kind of got introduced to the culture, so it wasn't just LSD anymore, but it was amphetamine where kids were becoming violent and there were murders happening. And he said that the reason he was doing this was he wanted to find out what the precipitating factors were, why some of these animals and then teens or kids would be violent with drugs and crowding and some wouldn't. And there were the common denominators he was looking for was whether it was psychological factors or biomedical factors. And there were a bunch of anomalies in his research. He had abandoned the mice research in 1967 to open the clinic, and he gave away his study to one of his researchers who used it as his PhD or master's thesis. And in 1971, when he started discussing this research or publishing about it, he changed the species of the animal from mice to rats. And he also omitted the fact that LSD was injected, and one of his fellow researchers who I interviewed was shocked by that. He also said, well, we used rats, not mice. And in his publishing, that's just an example of where he would change mice to rats. And another paper with mice to rats. And I tried to get him to explain this to me, and he never was able to. I'm not a scientist, but I would talk to people who did laboratory research and that, and they said rats and mice have very different reactions and responses to drugs, to crowding. He was never able to offer an explanation. Most importantly, he omitted the work of a guy named John Calhoun, who wrote this kind of landmark paper in 1962 called Population Density and Social Pathology, which was also an aggregate study of rats in groups. And John Calhoun found out, without the introduction of drugs, that rats did become violent and start attacking each other. But he found some other pathologies that were pretty interesting, and they were also in his paper that was in the Scientific American. So he reported that a dominant male rat would emerge from these aggregated rats, and he'd organize the female rats into harems, and that the subordinate male rats were in fear of him and would actually run away from the male rat if he just looked at them. And beneath the dominant male rat was a species he called, or a pathology called prober rats, who were submissive to the dominant rat and would kill female rats and male rats and sometimes cannibalize them in these frenzied attacks. And again, they said even if he looked at them, the subordinate rats would run away. Wait, that's too on the nose. He also invented the term behavioral sink, which became kind of like common. People would use that to describe crowding in the city. So in the United States in the early 60s, there was a lot of density in American cities, and that's when ridings began. And Calhoun was always referenced with any reporting about crowding, rioting in urban settings. And David published his mice study and used behavioral sinks in his work without ever crediting Calhoun or referencing Calhoun, even though their studies were nearly identical, except David introduced drugs and David either used mice or rats, or both. So that's a Grateful Dead and the Haight, and that's from David's book. So David coined his own phrase called psychedelic syndrome in 1968. So while David was operating the clinic, and for like a year or two before, he was studying the youth he was seeing and trying to understand why some of these kids would take one dose of LSD, have one trip, and have these radical personality transformations, and some wouldn't. He wanted to know if it was biological, psychological, if it had to do with setting, and his objective was to find out what precipitating factors there were to somebody having what he called a psychedelic syndrome, like a complete transformation. Again, David failed to reference an earlier study, 1962, by a guy named William McLaughlin, who was down at UCLA. McLaughlin was, we know now, was working for the CIA. All of his funding was from the CIA. He was studying early users of LSD and trying to determine why he called them normals. Why normals, some would take 1, 2, 3 doses and have no impact on their moral views, their world, their ideologies, and others would completely transform. And in 1962, he was trying to get funding for more research. And he knew that it would cause personality change in some people, but not all, and some of it was massive, sudden, and very dramatic. These are from his papers. And what was interesting is he also would talk about people who had these transformations who would kind of combine good and evil, and they couldn't tell the difference. It all became one. So what he discovered, or what he was searching for, was what were their variables, what he called extra drug variables that caused this. And the objective was to see if the personality changes could be measured, and more importantly, could it be predicted before a person used LSD? This is still all from his proposals. So in '67, he published his paper, basically confirming what he had hoped to find, that it could be predicted, and it was what he believed were personality factors, stuff deep within the recesses of a person's consciousness, some kind of psychological disorder or predisposing trait that would cause this different response to LSD. Now we're back to 1968. So in 1968, Roger moved his parole office from downtown San Francisco into the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. David gave him an office there to run something called the Amphetamine Research Project that was funded by an NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health grant, $38,000. And the objective of that research was, again, to find out why some people who were using lots and lots of amphetamine were becoming violent. And he got his research team to kind of not infiltrate, they were posing as researchers, but they were observing and questioning mostly communal kids in the Haight about their amphetamine use and following their, their criminal lives. And he called it, he said that they had to kind of be co-conspirators in what they were observing, because for them to get accurate readings on their criminal behavior and their violent behavior, they couldn't report it to the police, and he even made them sign an agreement with him that if they saw illegal activity, that it would be deleted and not reported to the police. And he said we couldn't do our research unless we had this kind of understanding with the people we were studying. So a final study that was done out of the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was called the Group Marriage Commune. Now, nobody had reported that until I found out about it during the course of my 20 years of reporting the book. David had sent an administrator named Alan Rose down to the Spahn Ranch, where the Manson family had migrated in 1968, to live among the family and study them and their habits. And he called it the Group Marriage Commune. And he published this paper in 1970, September of 1970. But it was actually prepared for publication, and it was supposed to appear in the summer of 1969. And right when they were, no, I guess it was the fall of 1969, when they were going to press, the Manson family was arrested for these murders, so they decided they better delay it. And he didn't quite know how to, basically to explain that they'd been watching this guy, emerge as kind of like this guru who could control these people using drugs and different kinds of behavior modification to turn them into murderers. So, and he also, Roger, they called it participant observers. That was Alan Rose who was with them. When Alan Rose left the commune in the fall of '68, he moved in with Roger Smith and his wife Carolyn Tiburon to write the paper. And Roger doesn't have a credit on it, but David does. Then we get to August 8th, 1969, back to the murders. That's Cielo Drive. This has been Vince Bugliosi after he had his victory, getting them convicted, or not convicted as much, that was kind of easy, but getting the death penalty for them was very difficult. So he explained to the jury in his closing argument during the death penalty phase, when he had to explain the dichotomy of how people who were convicted for being robots and having no control still deserved the death penalty because they had the free will to commit these horrific murders. And he said what Manson's gift was, or I don't know if you call it a gift, was that he could locate deep within someone's psyche a trigger, a precipitating factor, something that he could see that other people couldn't see, that would get them, he could activate it to get them to kill. And he said that was Manson's magic, that was his power. And the very first slide that was on when we came in is from the epilogue of his book, when he said that the one thing we might never know is how Manson learned how to control these people and get them to kill without remorse, with gusto, with relish, and they were, at the trial, they were laughing and skipping through the courtroom and singing while they're on trial for these horrific murders. During the death penalty phase, each of the defendants, except for Manson, took the stand and were questioned about the murders, and what they said is pretty chilling. So Susan Sadie Atkins, I'll just let you read it, it's pretty scary. And if you notice, she talks about it was right because it felt right. They didn't recognize evil and good. Everything was one.
We've studied the effects of amphetamine on mice. At high dosages, amphetamine produces death by convulsion. However, at lower dosages, when the mice are in groups, death also can result in many of the animals, primarily because they become violent, aggressive, fight, inflict wounds, and literally kill each other. Normally, mice get along quite well in group situations. Almost no other drug produces this violent interaction.
Trigger warning for that one.
Turn around once, girls, will you? Turn around there, girls.
That was the trial. Girls would arrive every day singing through the hallways and holding hands. So that's kind of it. I mean, the questions I'm asking, and if you read my book, unfortunately, I wasn't able to connect all the dots yet, and that's why I'm doing the second book, is whether or not Manson, who was basically given this get out of jail free card for 2 years while he transformed from this barely literate ex-con, 32 years old, into this master guru who could do everything the CIA had been trying to accomplish for 20 years, get these people to kill just on command without remorse, had somehow been influenced, information had been passed on to him, something through his affiliation with the scientists at the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, Roger Smith. And there's a whole other, I don't have enough time, but there's another scientist who was at the clinic named Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who was doing identical research for MKUltra, and you'll find out more about that if you read the book. But I'd love to hear questions if people.
Yeah, you can carry on. You've got time if you want to keep going. Unless we want to open it to...
I'd rather open it. I feel like I've talked too much.
Cool. Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
The first thing, so there's two things I kind of want to touch upon. First, the kind of MKUltra and COINTELPRO, and then second, want to touch on the psychedelic syndrome that you go into here. Because I think for many years, and even now, like, people balked at MKUltra, like, you know, and then when they found out that it, like, actually was a program and these things were happening, like, can you speak a bit to that about, you know, it just seems absolutely ridiculous, like we're living in this world, but these programs were actually happening, and the stuff that was happening in Haight Ashbury. Can you speak and open up a bit more about that? Yeah. Oh, I'll get the other mic as well.
Yeah, and I should say, when I was reporting this book, I had never heard of MKUltra. I didn't know what it was, and when I started, it kind of started creeping into my reporting. I didn't believe that something like that could have existed, and this is back in, my early reporting was the early 2000s, and there wasn't a lot of literature about MKUltra then. But once I started looking up, I'm like, this was a legit program that had been run by the CIA. And in 1973, when the head of the CIA, then Richard Helms, discontinued it, he had Sidney Gottlieb, who was kind of the technical services guy who ran the whole operation in the CIA. He had him destroy all 20-some years of records of the program. So to this day, there's really not a lot known about it. And the only reason we do know about it is in 74, 75, a guy named John Marks, who was a State Department worker, found files about it in his tedious work, organizing financial records for the State Department that had meant to have been destroyed. And he became a whistleblower and told some Congress people and a journalist named Seymour Hersh, so they reported it, and there were then 3 congressional investigations of it, and the CIA basically testified under oath that yes, we did this, yes, it was inhumane and illegal, but it didn't accomplish anything, it was a big mistake, and they were mocked by the press as the gang that couldn't shoot straight. Because they had spent so much money and done such horrific Nazi-like experiments on people without their knowledge or consent. But in fact, what I found out in my reporting was they were much more effective and successful than had ever been known. And I lucked into this, I found these letters between the scientist I just mentioned, who was also at the clinic, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, Jolly West. He was named on the front page of the New York Times in 1977 in a banner headline as one of, I think it was 8 academics who had secretly been contracted by the CIA from the early 50s to the late 60s, early 70s to do experiments using LSD and other drugs and hypnosis on patients, on students, on prisoners, even in what they called safe houses in New York City and San Francisco. And he told the New York Times that he had been approached to do it, but had turned them down because he didn't think LSD was safe with humans, which any good journalist then could have just gone. He had published academic papers about his LSD experiments. He said he had never given LSD to humans. He was never investigated. He went on to a very prolific career, head of the neuroscience and psychiatry department at UCLA until his death in about 1999. When I found out he had died and that he had had this office at the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic in the summer of '67, where Manson was going to see his parole officer and also taking the girls for medical treatment, I started to look into the possibility that he had lied, that he had really been an integral part of MKUltra. And I contacted UCLA and asked them if he had, left his papers there, which usually happens when somebody that had done research for as long as he had done it did. And they said, yeah, we've got 160 boxes, but they haven't been processed. And at that point, it was a magazine assignment, and I had a deadline that kept getting extended. So I kind of sweet-talked the head of special collections, and I begged her to just start releasing boxes. And she said, I'll process a box or 2 boxes a week if you want to come in. And I went in the entire summer, and Robert Caro, the famous biographer of Lyndon Johnson and others, said his mantra was turn every page. You have to look at every single piece of paper because you don't know what might have been misfiled or what might be in there. And I had that moment where I found letters from Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MKUltra, to Dr. West, and Dr. West's copies of his responses, where they were actually creating the blueprint for MKUltra in 1953, how they were going to conceal the experiments, who they were going to experiment on, what drugs they were going to do, what their objectives were. So he went to his grave never being held responsible for this. And so then once I got those letters, I really started looking into his activities. And he famously was involved in the John F. Kennedy assassination investigation when he became Jack Ruby's psychiatrist. If you don't know, Jack Ruby was the kind of small-time mafia guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald 3 days after Oswald had been arrested for shooting John F. Kennedy. He had never told his story about why he did what he did. And he was finally going to get retried. He'd been convicted. He was going to get retried. His lawyers won an appeal because they said he didn't get a fair trial in Dallas, where the murder happened. And he was also going to testify to the Warren Commission for the first time. And Jolly West was sent to examine him in prison. And he emerged from his prison cell and held a press conference and said in the preceding 48 hours, Jack Ruby had had a psychotic break from which he'd never recover, that he was having auditory and visual hallucinations, and hiding under the table. He said that there were Jewish babies being boiled alive outside his cell. And when Ruby actually did testify to the Warren Commission, they stopped it, and now we're in because he was incoherent and not making any sense. And what people didn't know at the time was that West had been a contracted MKUltra scientist since 1953, and one of the objectives in those letters was how to induce insanity in someone without their knowledge and make it permanent, using LSD, hypnosis, and other unidentified drugs. So I got my own kind of college education in MKUltra by looking all that stuff up, and you can read congressional testimony, the church hearings and the Kennedy Inouye hearings. So it was a legit program that was pretty horrific and violated every Hippocratic oath the doctor takes, the Nuremberg codes, everything.
Yeah, and that's what I think is just so mind-blowing, is that actually happened, and it also so the sessions that happened in here this morning, which was on the dark side of psychedelic healing, I think this flows really well into it, because it's a sort of modern Western way of using these substances for evil and for with a dark side to it. And who really knows what their ultimate goal was, and whether they say, it didn't achieve anything. It's like, okay, well, yeah. And yeah, I just think the implications for that for the wider community. Yeah, of course. Sorry, we've only got one mic. Actually, can we have the other mic until we open it up? That would be great. It makes it easier.
Yeah, one more thing I discovered in his files, which was relevant to the CIA saying that they had wasted all that money, they shouldn't have done it, they didn't learn anything, was I found a report from him to the CIA in 1955 saying he had successfully learned how to remove true memories in a human subject and replace them with false memories without the subject's knowledge, which was one of their main goals. If you can tamper with someone's memory, then anything's possible. And again, that's the most precious possession of a human being, is their mind and their memory, and he learned how to completely manipulate it.
Yeah, and that's also worrying. That's, again, things that are coming up in ceremony, just to kind of make it more relevant to hear. It's like, people having all of these experiences, and there's been this explosion of psychedelics more in the mainstream in recent years. And again, this is just more evidence to say this is, a serious thing to consider, with false memories coming up, or whether things, lots of sexual abuse memories have come up for people and they don't know whether it really happened or not, and just how powerful these substances are. And so, yeah, I wanted to talk about the MKUltra. And so can you talk a little bit more about COINTELPRO, because that's more about the ending of the 60s and then wanting to quash this sort of free love revolution. And yeah.
Again, the only reason we know about COINTELPRO was because a group of activists in Easton, Pennsylvania had discovered that the FBI had this secret program, and they organized a group to investigate them, and they found out that they had an archive of COINTELPRO papers in a warehouse in Pennsylvania, and they were just a group of concerned citizens. I think there were 15 of them, and they organized a break-in of the facility, and you guys are mostly probably too young, but they did it the night of the George Foreman, Muhammad Ali fight. I think it was Foreman and Ali, because they learned that the guards, by doing intelligence, loved fighting, loved boxing, and since it was held in Kenya or somewhere in Africa, it was going to be on in the middle of the night. So they broke in while the guards were watching the fight, stole all the boxes, and then shared them with a sympathetic person in Congress and a journalist, and I think this was 1974. And the COINTELPRO records are much more elaborate. They're not just financial records. And there were lots of hearings into that. And the FBI admitted that they were responsible for, I think, 20 or 30 murders that had been provoked by their agents who had infiltrated. Mostly, in this case, the COINTEL operations were with the Black Panthers. They were trying to, what they call, neutralize them and actually get them to kill other black militants. And in 1968, in November, they were responsible for the murders of 2 Panthers, by a rival group called the U.S. Slaves because they had informed them that each other was about to attack each other when a meeting was happening, and they took responsibility for this after the hearings and admitted to it. And there was a famous Panther named Geronimo Pratt that they had framed for a murder of 2 tennis players in Santa Monica during that same period. And he was under surveillance by the FBI. They knew that he was in San Francisco when the murders occurred. He went to prison for 10 years until this program was discovered, and then he was exonerated and released. There's a guy named Fred Hampton who was a Panther leader in Chicago, and one of the agents who had been posing as a Panther drugged him and went home with him, had a drink, drugged his drink, left, and then the agents raided the house and shot the guy, or the apartment, shot the guy to death in his bed. That's, how determined these people were to stop what they thought was a revolution that was about to happen. And I found I didn't find a document. These researchers released a document from J. Edgar Hoover to the head of the LA field office for the FBI's COINTELPRO group, saying what we have to do is target the white celebrities who are supporting the Panthers and make them think that when the revolution finally happens, they're going to be lined up with all the rest of the whites in their fancy homes and slaughtered. And that document was, I think, December of 1968 or January of 1969, 8 months before Sharon Tate and her friends were killed in a house that kind of symbolized the lefty Hollywood community. It's where Roman Polanski's very good friends, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, Jane Fonda would all gather. They even had, Abigail Fulcher was involved in Panther support groups raising money for the Panthers. So I basically create a circumstantial case in the book. I'm trying to make it not circumstantial with the second book, but we'll see.
I just think it's just so mind-blowing, like all of the... Because, I think people go down rabbit holes online but with certain things, but I just feel like the evidence is just very compelling for this, and I find it very mind-blowing. Before we open up to audience questions, let's go a bit more into psychedelic syndrome. This is an academic conference, and lots of researchers here are looking at whether it's personality traits, biomedical, psychological factors in what influence the psychedelic experience. In particular, like personality change is like something that's well researched, but there's still not enough into it. And I think the extremity of the personality changes in these cases with the Manson family, it's a super, super interesting case study is what I'm trying to say, and I'm just sort of wondering about the implications in more modern context, and if you could...
You mean, is it being done today, or...?
No, not in that there's like a government conspiracy, but in that a warning about
the
these...
dangers.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, because, I ask my question myself a lot, have I gone too far? I mean, is it possible that these guys were just criminals who then conveniently said, I'm talking about the women and Tex Watson mostly, who said, that brainwashing defense, we can use it, to our benefit to try to get out if we were under his control. But, I mean, there's pretty compelling information out there by their prison psychiatrists. So each of the 3 women, Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins, who went to prison for these murders, and Tex Watson as well, renounced Manson, but it took them anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And their psychiatrists all believe that this was a genuine transformation that had occurred before the murders happened in their psyches. And there's some video of Susan Atkins doing an interview about 7 or 8 years after she was in prison saying, I still hear him in my head. I can't get his voice out of my head. And each of them said stuff like that to their guards, how they would hear him in their dreams, that there was something that had been done to them that made them, kind of automatically do or think his thoughts.
And the similarities from the previous talks as well about the shaman, you're going to the Amazon and being exploited and sorcery happening there. There's parallels from what I've heard before. So, yeah, and I just feel, because when we spoke before you came to the conference as well, and Alan sitting here can probably speak to this, there's a book called St. Peter's Snow, which is a novel written in 1933, is it, Alan? Yeah. And it's a very short novel, and it's about a baron who wants to benevolently spike the peasants in the town to turn back, to find God again. And sorry, spoiler alert, he does it. But during his operation, it's like an elaborately planned operation. He wants to spike the peasants to find God again and become better people and be more benevolent. And the priest in the town says, you have to be careful. You're not invoking Jehovah. You're invoking Moloch. You just don't know it yet. So it's like you're invoking the bad, the evil spirit instead of the good. And the baron's like, yeah, whatever. And he spikes the peasants and they all revolt and they come and kill him. And then the guy who's narrating, sort of the protagonist in the story, like wakes up in this hospital bed and it's like, did I just dream all that, or have they kind of controlled me? There's just like kind of all these weird sort of conspiracy parallels. And this book was written in 1933, pre the synthesis of LSD and pre-bicycle day, and it's about a fungus that grows on wheat. And this was like, the decade before LSD was ever synthesized. Anyway, that's a whole nother inquiry. But the reason I'm saying this is because I just feel like all of these stories and all of that, it's like, what are we invoking in the psychedelic renaissance right now? Like, all of the things we spoke about in this morning's sessions, it's like, we need to be careful that it's not always love and light, it's not always rainbows and healing and love.
Here,
I
went to a few of the speakers' things, and people, were talking about the sacredness, and the medicine. I'm like, oh God, I'm going to come and piss all over my side.
No, yeah, and this session before it is talking about that, and I just think we have to hit home how important that side of it is, and it's not all good, it's not all bad. It's this like dance and this nuance. Which, kind of what goes into that here. So I am going to open up to audience questions, but do you have anything to add before we open?
Not really that I can think of. I'll interject if I think of something. But.
All right, amazing. Yes, I have a hand here. Sorry, wait for the mic.
Just briefly, I remember reading your book like a year or so ago, and this question popped in my head. And the evidence you present is really compelling, and it has like a really profound like implications even today. And I remember thinking, if that was like my name in front of that book, I'd be feeling kind of twitchy, a little nervous, and looking out for cars in front of my house and stuff. What's been your experience of that? Have you been whistleblowers don't really have things don't often turn out too well for whistleblowers, and people are potentially exposing controversial subjects and things. So that's it basically. I just remember thinking if I ever saw you like this, I'd love to ask you that question. Do you feel like comfortably below the radar, or do you feel like there may be a little?
Well, I'm sorry. Do I didn't quite.
Yeah, basically, yeah. That's basically it. Do you feel like you're still below the radar, or as a potential whistleblower, do you feel as I would looking for
I honestly
cars
get
out the house?
asked that every time I do a public appearance. I get asked that question. I couldn't, think about. If I thought about that, I wouldn't get anything done. And to my knowledge, no. I mean, I've never felt surveilled or threatened. I mean, I've been threatened, but the person who was my biggest nemesis and opponent who tried to stop me from publishing my book was Vincent Bugliosi. So he was the prosecutor who put the Manson family in prison and then wrote Helter Skelter, the, to this day, best-selling true crime book of all time about the case. And he and I started well, and then the book's got a lot of crazy shit in it. I found out that he had he had committed crimes in the prosecution. He had withheld exculpatory evidence and information from the defense attorneys that showed Manson had these interactions with people who were provoking him and prodding him. And when Vincent Bugliosi started finding out what I was doing, he was tracking me talking to people before I talked to them, telling them not to talk to me. And then when I finally had a very big confrontational meeting with him at his house 7 years after I'd begun, I think it opens the book, it's a prologue. You know, he was threatening me then, and he would turn off. Each of us had 2 tape recorders. I thought I was the only one that was that neurotic, but I'm horrible with technology, and I would never trust that my home recorder would work, so I'd have a backup. And he was the same way, which tells me something. So he would turn off the recorders, and then he would threaten me. And then later he would send threatening letters to my first publisher saying that he would own this company. He already would own me and my life if I published this stuff. I mean, he tried everything to stop it. But as far as government and, I mean, maybe I should be more worried, but I never really have been. Yeah.
Do you mind passing the mic back to you? And then, so yeah, just, we'll do the front and we'll work our way back up. Oh, sorry.
I was wondering if you read Drugs as a Weapon Against Us from...
I'm sorry?
Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. It's a book by John Potash.
Oh, no, I've heard of it. And I feel like, is he alive?
Yeah, he's alive. It's a book from like 8-10 years ago, and he basically document all the all what has been done by the.
I might have interviewed. I mean, I interviewed. It sounds crazy, but thousands of people over 20 years, and I would interview every expert on drugs, violence, cults. And when you said his name, I know the name. I'm sure I have the book.
Well, it was not my question. It was just to say that he basically demonstrates that Mark Chapman, the killer of, he demonstrates a lot of killings of MK Ultra, basically, and with a lot of proofs and everything. And he talks also about Mark Chapman, the killer of John Lennon, that he's been totally brainwashed for several years in Lebanon and everything. And I arrived in the middle of your talk, so I don't know about Manson. Do you reckon Manson was also brainwashed, or it was only used as an excuse to end the hippie movement?
To answer that, I have to be theoretical. It sounds like a cop-out. I believe it's one or the other, that he was either brainwashed or he was shown techniques, and they were shared with him. What I can prove is that what we know about him for those 2 years was covered up by the police and Vince Bugliosi. They knew this stuff, and that's why I think we still don't know. But are you saying, was he a willing participant or was he a dupe? If I had to bet, I'd say it's more likely he didn't know what was happening, and he still doesn't know. There's a new book that came out, I think about 6 months ago, and the authors reached out to me a few times, where his book makes the case that Chapman was the Lennon killer, was an MK Ultra, that he'd been programmed to do it. And there's a lot of people that believe James Earl Ray, who killed Martin Luther King. He had all these, they had similar patterns that Manson had. They were in prison first for a while, and then they were out. The government was lenient with them, and they were tracked, and they would get these infusions of money that was never explained. And the obvious one is Sirhan B. Sirhan, who killed Robert F. Kennedy, or who shot at Robert F. Kennedy, but might not have killed him. I spent a lot of time researching that, but it's not in my book because we didn't have enough space, and I couldn't connect him to the scientists that I was writing about. But that's something that I'm almost certain that he was a patsy, as they call it, Sirhan. So yeah, I'll find that Potash book too. I'm curious about it.
Thanks for the talk, Tom. And there's a lot of information that I'd not realised before, but what I think of the Manson murders is what you kind of mentioned, that the hippie movement ends at that point. It's such a powerful media event as much as anything that instantly there's the fear, primal fear in anybody that this could happen to you in any little group, and this is the logical conclusion. And my question, and it kind of runs on from the talks this morning, which I did miss, but I know Adam and Matta Busby and Jules Evans, is that as having worked in journalism and see how narratives are formed, that we're kind of edging towards that again. It's not that the fears don't exist. It doesn't, not that Manson might or might not be a psyop. It's the fact that, you know, outside the scientific institutions, the fear is that medicine circles, etc., with some charismatic individual might be able to get a group of people to do something really terrible. So we're continually being told that the scientists are the only safe way to do this. And do you feel with any of that reporting that all, you know, we're almost one step away from one event that the media can then jump on again and say, was it, wasn't it? And we're now so primed to the idea of psyops that you can do the double and say, oh yeah, that was all a psyop, but you know, the pandemic is a psyop, and everyone's got that in their head that no one takes anything seriously. Just but there can be an extra suppression. Of you know, our hope, some of our aims is to decriminalisation and to the feeling that generally there's a positive outcome, even with anomalies. But we're getting the anomalies being used as a.
Well, I mean, one of my concerns and worries about publishing my book was I don't want. Here's what's happened since my book came out. Every time there's a mass shooting, I get inundated with emails and messages on my social platforms from people telling me that they're convinced that this kid or person who shot all these children in a school, or I haven't even checked, but yesterday there was a shooting at University of Florida or Florida State. Everybody now, and I hope it's not because of my book, you know, I'm not that grandiose, but everybody thinks that every mass event like that is a psyop. And especially the unexplained ones. I mean, I was watching the Trump rally on television when he got shot, and I immediately knew that my book sales were going to go crazy, and that I was going to get contacted.
Did you organize it?
No. Honestly, I swear. But I also, the next thing I do when I have a chance is, if I get the name of the shooter before they erase their social media, I go to my things and see if they're followers of mine, because I'm curious, and I hope that, you know, my book wouldn't provoke something like that. And again, that's narcissism and grandiosity, but it happens every time something like that happens. It's just like tons of people want to know if it was MK Ultra.
Sorry, it's in the middle. And then, yeah, cool. We've got time, guys.
Thank you very much for a very compelling talk. I wanted to see if you could comment a bit on the wider parapolitical associated things to do with patsies and the record of the intelligence agencies and that. So there's a book called Program to Kill by David McGowan, and it talks a lot about how a lot of serial killers at the height of serial killing in the 70s were actually connected to wider networks, human and drug trafficking networks, intelligence agencies, and that they were used to conveniently cover up what had occurred and make it look like they were lone wolves. And similarly, Jonestown. Jim Jones was another instance of a criminal who kept getting away with it. And then Leo Ryan, a congressman, was killed after trying to expose the CIA's budgets at Jonestown when he went to visit it. So that wider history of patsies and larger networks, I think, is one of the key findings of your talk, and I'd love to hear maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I did look into Jonestown quite a bit, and I don't know if people are all familiar with Jonestown here. It was a mass suicide, which actually, most of those people didn't commit suicide. Most of those people were shot by Jones's paramilitary army. But a lot of them did drink the Kool-Aid and die. And again, it's not in my book because I did spend lots of time researching it. I couldn't connect it to the doctors that I was writing about. I'm looking into it now again because Jolly West, the one who was at the clinic, there were reports that he was involved. If that was a lab experiment created on that in Grenada by the CIA, it fits the pattern, like you just said. And I mean, Jones had these incredible relationships with power, in San Francisco. And he started his church when I think he left Indiana in Mendocino County, north of San Francisco, which is where the Manson group, that's where he was arrested when I showed that clip. And he was going up to Mendocino back and forth for also that first year, and some of his followers had left Jones's church to join him, a guy named Brooks Poston and Dean Morehouse. So at my I'm like open-minded about all this now. I still try to be a critical thinker. And I know Dave McGowan's work. I mean, most people ask me about his scenes from the Canyon book, about Laurel Canyon. He's a great writer and reporter, but he doesn't substantiate a lot of his stuff. And like, there's no footnotes, there's no sourcing. So I try to, I mean, that's another reason it took me 20 years. And if you get my book, I try to get people to get the print version because I've got 60 pages of endnotes that I had to fight my publisher for. And they're really important because it shows every archive that every document's from. It sources everything. But I think, who knows about the whole Patsy thing, and, you know, was Oswald a Patsy? Did Oswald shoot Kennedy? I'm cautiously optimistic that these JFK files that may or may not be completely released, maybe unredacted. So far, they've been redacted. There might be information in there, but it's hard, you know, because the US government's a powerful group, and if they want to suppress information, they do it.
You define a patsy for people that don't know.
Oh, a patsy is somebody who's been basically either hypnotized. Usually Jolly West was using drugs and hypnosis and other drugs, a couple of drugs that never even got names, to program people to have no memory of feeling a compulsion to be in a place, not even act, just to be somewhere. And then, you know, get arrested for something. I mean, Sirhan had a gun, had bullets, had been at a firing range, but if you're to believe him, from the day he was arrested, you know, in the pantry at the Ambassador Hotel, he said, I don't know how I got here or what I'm doing here. Yes, I'm holding this gun, or I was holding this gun, and I have no idea why I shot him. And he had a missing period of, I think, 3 months. He worked as a groomsman at a racetrack and had either fallen or been kicked by a horse. And his family said he just disappeared for 3 months, and when he came back, he was a different person. And there's a pattern of that with a lot of these people.
Can we go to Andy, just in yellow, sorry. A little bit around, sorry.
Firstly, I'd just like to say Tom's book is available on the Breaking Convention bookstall downstairs. We've got several copies, so flock and buy it, because as an author myself, I can honestly say that Tom's book is one of the most detailed and referenced books I've ever come across. It's absolutely astonishing and breathtaking in the depths of its research, and it's worth just reading the footnotes alone. They're a separate book, really. So that's something I wanted to tell you. Secondly, my question is, do you think that Manson was getting his acid supplied to him from one, you know, government-based source, or was he just using street acid?
Yeah, hold it close, because it's hard.
All right. Do you think that Manson was getting his acid from the government, or do you think that he was just using street acid?
I've never been able to find out where he got his acid. It's a huge mystery, and smarter people with better investigative skills have tried to find out where he got it.
Yeah, because in the various books I've read about Manson, and I've read far too many, quite frankly, you get people talking about they were going buying acid from this person, or, you know, the Satan slaves or whatever were bringing it in, and so on and so forth, which is all well and good, but I would have thought if he was trying to consistently brainwash people, he would have liked to have used a consistent dosage or a particular type of acid, but there seems to be no evidence to suggest that. But it's an area of investigation, I suppose, that hasn't been...
Well, if you're familiar with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, Laguna Beach, that whole LSD operation, I did, uncover links between him and them, selling the Orange Sunshine acid. Not to my satisfaction to even include in the book, enough that he was getting it from them regularly. But they were also kind of a government operation that was surveilled, and the government knew about them. Yeah. It's something I am exploring a little bit more in the book, the second book.
Excellent. Who's next?
Sorry, can I just... and Andy, so for those of you who don't know, Andy's author of Albion Dreaming, which is like the best history of LSD, British LSD history.
It's the only history.
Pardon?
It's the only
The only, well, and it's the best. Well, there we go. It's the best and the only. While we've been listening to Tom's talk, are there any parallels of like things that you've researched and written about that you've been like you know, you're sitting there thinking?
No, I've never found anything that I could attribute to possible, you know, secret government agency attempts to control people. In the 1950s, they were using it, the military were using it, the MI5, MI6 were using it as a possible interrogation tool, but that fell apart because they realised that it couldn't be used as an interrogation tool, because when people are tripping, they don't want to talk about things other than what they're seeing in front of them or whatever, so that didn't work. It was used on the British military in the 60s in three tests because they thought they could control the enemy by, you know, dropping acid in the water supply and things like that. Well, firstly, you can't put acid in the water supply. Chemically, it doesn't work. And secondly, when they did the testing on troops, and you can see this on YouTube, basically they just wanted to climb trees and talk to squirrels. So it was not effect. But I've never found anyone who I could possibly attribute to having been part of a control program. But we've got a guy in Britain who was like the British equivalent of Julian West, a guy called William Sargent, who wrote Battle for the Mind. And his archives are in the Wellcome Foundation in London, but most of them are closed for 70 years for reasons because they're to do with individual patients, and it's a confidentiality thing. But I think if anyone was involved in that sort of thing in Britain, it was definitely William Sargent, and you know, I am sort of looking into that slowly.
Yeah. I'm sorry, and where are his papers?
At the Wellcome Foundation in London, as in W.
I don't know. Is that a town or London?
London's a big town, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a place. I'll tell you about it. Welcome, Johnson speaking. I think, sorry, I got mixed up. I think you were next, sorry. Yeah. And then we'll go. If there's any questions at the back, just wave to me. Okay, cool.
Cool. Hi, thank you, Tom. I'm sure you must be aware, but I just wanted to say that they declassified the 112 sub-projects of MKUltra about, 5-10 years ago, and you can see the kind of three remits: psychedelics, mind, like Manchurian Candidate, mind-blanking stuff, and also cults. Is their three remits. But I have a question. It's a bit of a follow-on, in a way, from the one before about the greater influence of the government in the whole proliferation of psychedelic culture in the first place. There's people like Augustus Stanley, who was the Grateful Dead's LSD guru, who I think admittedly was an MKUltra test subject, and then was the one proliferating acid. I think there's Puharek and FBI stockpiles somehow, and he formed Esalen, obviously a massive influence. And also, I wonder if you've come across the Process Church in any of this, which seems to be like a linking.
Yeah. So if people aren't familiar with the Process Church, they were a satanic church that moved. Actually, they started in London, I think, and they migrated to San Francisco right around 66, 67. And their headquarters was not too far from where Manson established his commune in the Haight on Cole Street. The clinic, Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, was on Clayton, and the Process Church was right around the corner. So Ed Sanders, who was a journalist, he wrote a book, one of the first books about the murders, called The Family, and about the commune. They came out a year or two before Vince Bugliosi's Helter Skelter. And he had a whole chapter about the Process intersection with Manson, and that Manson had been influenced by them. But the church sued him, and they weren't successful, but they scared him enough that he removed it. Excuse me. I never saw any. I mean, Manson definitely crossed paths with what they call proscenians or something, with members of the church. But I never saw anything kind of concrete that they had anything really significant to do with him and his activities. I know they visited him in prison after, but I think that was more like damage control to make sure that he wasn't going to say that he had this connection to them.
Was Lynette Fromm?
Sorry?
Was Lynette Fromm member of Process Church?
Squeaky. I don't know.
Yeah.
She's the one who shot Gerald Ford, or was going to shoot Gerald Ford, the president, about 4 years later. Manson also had an intersection with Scientology, and he studied Scientology in prison. And then when he got out, a lot of his phrasing and some of the methods he used, he borrowed from Scientology, from the Dale Carnegie book, How to Influence strangers and make friends or something. But a lot of people think that I'm kind of an agent for Scientology and or the Process Church because I don't implicate them in any way. And there's whole podcasts that have been created to attack me, which are fun to watch, frankly, because they literally think I'm a paid agent of the Church of Scientology because I don't talk that much about it. I just don't think it had that much of an influence beyond what little stuff he learned about in prison. But yeah, the Process thing is interesting. I think they're now called the Best Friends Society. They're an animal shelter or something. Yeah, it's a crazy story. Somebody should make a movie about them.
Yeah.
There is a documentary about them.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Is it new or is it a new documentary?
I think it's been out for about 4 years.
Okay, yeah, I'll look for it.
Yeah, I've got it. I've watched it. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
It gives all the people that were involved in it.
Do you think they had any?
I don't think they
Yeah. Good, then I'm right.
They had similar, like, personality override things going on. You'd apparently go in a meet and you'd stare at each other, a stranger, and then describe the things you find annoying about them or hate about them. So they were doing this kind of almost charisma, and they were known for just these cold, deep stares and these intense charismas. It just, to me, it has that sort of quality echo of this. Yeah. Yeah.
Because of the whole psychedelic scene, they wanted to sort of counteract the love and all that sort of thing. So it's more of a sort of joke.
Cool. Sorry, I've just we've only heard from men. Is there any women here that would like to speak? Because it's very male dominated. No. Okay. Do you mind passing it up to Mark then? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have a question just about, because I haven't read your book, just to clarify some of your implications, or maybe they just are remaining suggestive. So are you saying that Manson was explicitly conditioned somehow by MKUltra, or that the women in the family were, or both? And what do you make of other possible explanations for the phenomenon? So psychopathy, for example, like the personality type. Are you suggesting that MKUltra were trying to somehow induce that in people? And also other explanations like, I guess, the banality of evil and charisma, and the tendency of, because the excuse in court that was just following orders, a lot like in the Eichmann trial, right? So what do you make of other non-MKUltra related explanations? And just to clarify how exactly you think Manson was involved in that. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Sure. My big admission in the book is I didn't figure it out. And it's why it took me so long, because I kept thinking I was going to get the answer, get the smoking gun. And as my agent said, you've got a lot of smoking pistols. And you can prove that things happened differently. You can prove what was covered up. But it's one of the things that haunts me is I can't answer your question. I can only theorize. I believe that he was definitely protected by the government and enabled as far as you'll see, when you read the book, you'll see there were so many times he was arrested in the 2 years before the murders. A week after the murders, the Los Angeles sheriffs conducted a raid on the Spahn Ranch and arrested 33 Manson family members and Manson and held them for 3 days and released them without charges. And there were submachine guns, there were underage girls, stolen vehicles, narcotics, and Manson was the only person named in the search warrant, and he's named as the leader of this criminal organization who's on federal parole. That was enough to revoke his parole, again, immediately. There's like a dozen examples of that. But as far as, hopefully in the second book, I'm looking into psychiatrists who had met Manson and evaluated him when he was in juvenile detention home as a teenager and his early years in prison. There were a couple psychiatrists who were affiliated with the MKUltra who were at each of the institutions he was at. And what's interesting, and half of this is in the book and half of it isn't, when he was arrested at that raid, he had stolen credit cards in his pocket. So when I interviewed some of the deputies who were involved in it, I said, why were no charges filed? And they said, because we woke them up at 4 o'clock in the morning and none of them had the contraband on them. So there were no car keys in their pockets, there were no weapons on them. And I said, but he could have been charged with conspiracy. And then I found the arrest reports, and he actually had stolen credit cards in his pocket. So that's in my book, but what's not in my book is the stolen credit cards were from one of the psychiatrists who was an MK Ultra psychiatrist who had been at Terminal Island working with prisoners, Manson's last place before he was released. And I had called him when I got his name from the reports, and he told me 3 different stories in 2 days. And that's one of, I mean, believe it or not, even though I had 20 years, I still need another 20 because it's so hard. You can't just throw this shit out there. You have to have corroborating sources and documents. But I wish I could answer that question better.
Can you also talk about your, because you spoke to Manson, talk more about that, because you wanted to interview him more, right?
Yeah. I guess I only have a few minutes,
no,
right?
it's okay, we're fine.
Yeah, I interviewed Manson about 2 or 3 times in 2000, and it was very frustrating because anybody who's seen Manson being interviewed on camera sees that he plays games. He answers in riddles. He might be playing a character that's, psychotic. He doesn't answer. He gets aggravated. He dances and does weird facial things. So I really wanted to at least try to be in the same room as him and press him hard on stuff. And I still knew I might not get it, but I couldn't get in the same room as him because he was in the hole when I interviewed him, meaning he was in solitary, and they let them out like 1 night a week to have phone calls. So his outside guy arranged my phone calls, and it was, just an exercise in futility. He was speaking to me in puzzles, and I did get to say Happy Valentine's Day to him because it was Valentine's Day the first time I interviewed him, and I just realized at like 9 o'clock at night, that's my Valentine's Day, is Charlie Manson. But he seemed to appreciate it. He's like, hey man, thanks a lot, same to you. But I never got to really, really confront him with stuff I had, and that was frustrating. But one interesting thing was he got angry at me every time we spoke, but especially the first couple times, and he had a guy who was kind of his prison body guy, his protector, named Pincushion, because he had been stabbed so many times they called him Pincushion. So Pincushion would grab the phone and say, you can't talk to the old man like that. Who do you think you are? And then he'd put Charlie back on, and then Charlie would say, you have to go to Red Skelton's house. There's keys hidden under the basement, that the World War II Korean pilot, just all this crazy stuff. And his guy on the outside, Grey Wolf, would tape the calls. It would be a 3-way call from prison to Grey Wolf and then to me. And at one point, Grey Wolf, in the middle of these 3 or 4 days of phone calls, says to me, he's not going to talk to you anymore. And I said, why not? And he goes, he thinks you're trying to send him back to prison. I mean, not back, he's there, but never get him out because you're talking about other bodies and other murders and stuff. And I said, well, I'm just trying to get the truth. And he said, listen to what Charlie said about you after he disconnected you, when he and I are talking. So he played me like a 2-minute tape of Manson sounding like an attorney, who, like he's saying, Gray, he goes, this Tom O'Neill, he's talking about manslaughter, murders, bodies and stuff. I could get years tacked on, and I don't want that. And I'm like, why can't he talk to me like that? And I never figured out if the whole thing was an act or whether it was who he really was. Very frustrating.
Yeah, incredible. I've got a mic back now, yeah. So we are coming to the end of the session, and I think just to close, if you have any remarks, Tom, about your kind of future with this, and maybe how being at this event, because I think it's this event's probably quite different from the things that you usually speak at, maybe, or not, I don't know. And maybe how that sort of ties in, and just some closing remarks on that.
I just want to learn more at this event. It's fun. I'm learning about ayahuasca and things like that that I want to explore. But I'm sorry, what do I?
Just about your future implications and future projects and what
Yeah,
your next
yeah.
steps
So I
are.
did this thing with Rick Rubin that's going to be hours and hours, and I'm so scared that people are going to get really bored and turn it off. I think he's announcing it today, and we've already taped it. He has this really brilliant woman who's London-based, who's named Aishat, and I guess she's well known over here, but I cannot remember her last name. It's really complicated. So she taped me at his studio in LA about a month ago for 6 or 7 days, and I think it's coming out in May, and it's going to be me and her just kind of talking about what we talked about today, and then there's hopefully going to be a scripted adaptation of the book with this really great creative Hollywood guy that will hopefully be better than a little documentary that they
Yes,
did.
sorry, and the Netflix one.
I'm not happy with.
Yeah,
it.
you're
It was
not
done by
endorsing the
Errol
Netflix
Morris,
one.
one of the best directors in the business, but it wasn't a collaboration. I thought it would be, and it's just a very superficial treatment of a very complicated story, unfortunately.
So that is a massive shame, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.